Welcome, everyone, to the 86th episode of the Clements Bookworm. I am Angela Unk, Director of Development at the Clements Library. And I will just let you know, as you all heard, we like to use the chat. So please go ahead and chime in and change the settings to everyone. My colleagues, Ann Bennington-Helber and Katie Jade, will be monitoring the chat, pasting in helpful information and links. So if you have a question today, please be sure to put that in the Q&A section, because that will keep them all together. And you can also read other people's questions and upvote if it's a question that you also have. We do have the live machine captions turned on today, so you can toggle those on or off and change the size of the font. And I can only control so much of what you see, so please take the little separator and change the relative size of the speaker and the slides so that it looks good on your screen. This program is brought to you by the William L. Clements Library, located on the campus of the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. Our mission is to collect, preserve, share, and promote the study and discussion of primary sources related to all aspects of history and culture of North America and the Caribbean to the early 20th century. And this is something that I always do, partly because, and I've mentioned it in the past, I'm a descendant of the Saginaw Chippewa tribe. And I just think that this is one of those things that it's good to acknowledge. That the University of Michigan is located on the territory of the Anishinaabe people. In 1817, the Ojibwa, Ottawa, and Potawatomi nations made the largest single land donation to the University of Michigan, offered ceremonially as a gift in the text of the Treaty of the Foot of the Rapids, so that their children could be educated in a Western manner. We acknowledge the history of Native displacement that allowed the University of Michigan to be founded, and today we reaffirm contemporary Anishinaabe ties to this land and their profound contributions to this institution. Miigwech. All right. If you haven't yet taken the poll question, quick, you need to very fast choose your answer. And I am going to end the poll and share the results. All right. So I'm impressed by how many people knew the answer. So wax models is indeed the answer. So yeah, it is correct. And just to get you thinking about the art in the 1770s, and we will discuss more soon. So stop sharing. All right. And today it's my pleasure to welcome back to the Bookworm Paul Erickson, the Randolph G. Adams Director of the Clements Library. Paul joined the Clements in January of 2020 and received his BA in English from the University of Chicago and an MA and PhD in American Studies from the University of Texas at Austin. Paul has experience working in publishing, the nonprofit sector, and management consulting, as well, of course, as the special collections library world. So thank you, Paul, and I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Angela, and thanks to all of you for joining us on this windy and snowy morning here in Ann Arbor. I hope it is a little more pleasant wherever you are. And I especially want to thank my good friend Zara Anishanslin for joining us today to talk about her fantastic book, The Painter's Fire. I'm really excited to have her here today. Zara is Associate Professor of History and Art History at the University of Delaware, where she is also Director of of the Museum Studies and Public Engagement Program. She previously taught at the City University of New York and Columbia University and was a postdoctoral fellow in the Department of History at Johns Hopkins. Her award-winning first book, which is also fantastic, Portrait of a Woman in Silk, Hidden Histories of the British Atlantic World, was published by Yale in 2016. And for her new book, which we're going to talk about today, The Painter's Fire, A Forgotten History of the Artists Who Championed the American Revolution, which came out from Harvard earlier this year. She had more fellowships than we have time to list. If you read the acknowledgments, it's truly an astonishing group of fellowships that she received to support her research on this book. She's an avid public historian. She often works with museums on exhibitions, including the reinstallation of the Early American Wing at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. She is the creator and co-host of the podcast Thing for Things, the history podcast where things matter and stuff happens. And according to her children, who are lovely people but are not to be trusted on this score, the only cool thing on her CV is that she served as the material consultant for Lin-Manuel Miranda's show Hamilton, the Exhibition. So thank you so much for joining us, Zara, and take it away.
Thank you, Paul. And thank you, Anne and Angela, for all of your magnificent help putting this together. And to everyone who is giving up one of their precious pre-holiday or mid-holiday mornings to be with us. I really appreciate it. And I'm so looking forward to the conversation with Paul, who happens to be one of my favorite people and scholars. So it's a wonderful combination. So if we have the next slide, I'm actually going to start by talking a little bit about the cover. And my children are a perfect segue from this. So thank you for setting me up in that way, Paul, because when my publishers sent me the mock-up of this cover, and I can brag about it because I literally had nothing to do with it, I was really delighted by it because I think you'll agree it's really cool looking. I mean, it's got flames and ships and oceans and tossing waves. It's very dramatic and I love it. But I sent an image of it to my Gen Z children and I said, this is great because isn't it fire? And they were like, oh my God, Mom, never say that again. And so, of course, every talk I've given, that's exactly what I've opened with. And because one of my hobbies is embarrassing my children, and it's been delightful. My daughter has been present for one of my talks, and I got to see it had exactly the intended effect. So, so I'm glad that you mentioned my children at the outset. The other reason I like to talk about the cover is that The Painter's Fire, the title, is taken from an homage to a Phyllis Wheatley poem, To S.M., a young African artist, on first seeing his work. And there's a line in there that Wheatley has in which she references the power of the poets and the painter's fire. And one of the reasons we chose this title was to acknowledge the creative vision of people who are historically marginalized, such as Phyllis Wheatley and the other artists at the heart of this book, and to talk about the importance of creative vision and passion in fueling political movements and driving revolution. And so the title itself, I think, is something I like to explain because it does pay homage, as I mentioned, not just to Wheatley, but to all of the other 18th century lives who have been somewhat forgotten over time until now. And so I really like to give them their historical due by talking about why the title matters. So I just saw the joke about the side-eye from the Gen Z children. Yes, it's delightful, isn't it? So if we go to the next slide, I'm going to set the stage a bit. So the American Revolution, you might expect that we would begin in Boston or Virginia or Philadelphia, but I'm going to start in London, which is where my book starts as well, and more precisely in London's Royal Academy of Art. And you can picture the scene. The backdrop that you see behind the portrait of Queen Charlotte there is what the Royal Academy's second floor gallery looks like. So as you can see, it is a massive space, 32-foot high ceilings, and it's absolutely crammed pretty much from, almost floor to ceiling with hundreds of paintings. So I'm opening with the scene like this in 1780, which is the first year that the new grand space was dedicated. So it was dedicated through the largesse of King George III and Queen Charlotte. So they themselves were present for the opening. New portraits of the two by American artist Benjamin West, Queen Charlotte's version you see on the screen here, were unveiled for the first time. And also unveiled was the debut painting entry of a 22-year-old artist called Joseph Wright, who was a promising award-winning, he'd won a sculpture award at this point, Royal Academy student who was notable for being one of the first Americans to study there. And this is important because he's 22, he's not yet matriculated from the Royal Academy. This is his first big splash onto the art scene. You can't just roll in and decide to hang your painting on the wall in the Royal Academy. You have to be selected by a jury of experts. And so he passed that test. And if he hoped to become famous, he achieved his goal, because even though it was one of many hundreds of paintings that year, it was one of the most widely remarked upon in the entire show. Now, what it showed was his famous mother, who you see on the next slide, American wax sculptor Patience Wright, modeling a head on her lap. Now, she herself was famous. This is not the portrait itself. Can't show you that portrait because it's lost to us. More on that in a minute. But her image was famous through portraits like this, which were published in magazines and copied into prints and easily accessible to wide groups of people. She ran a popular wax museum in London that she'd founded in the early 1770s. And by 1780, she was famous. People knew exactly what she looked like. She was in part famous for the spectacular way in which she allegedly modeled her wax heads. So she had these very penetrating eyes, apparently, and she would chat you up while she was making your wax likeness, but she would be making the wax likeness under her skirts. And then when she was done, she would whip it out and astonish onlookers with the realness of the likeness, and probably titillate them more than a little bit with the sexual suggestiveness of the way she did this. Now, anyone who knows anything about sculpture knows she probably is not working blind under her skirts the entire time, but she was a real showman, and so she knew how to create this celebrity persona. By 1780, she was also infamously and correctly rumored to be a spy working on behalf of the American patriots. So having her portrait in this show at the Royal Academy at all is interesting, since she's known to be an American spy at this point. And it showed her portrait by her son did show her modeling a head. But it wasn't just any head. It was the decapitated head of King Charles I, England's king, famously beheaded by his own subjects in the English Civil War. And looking down at her work were busts of King George and Queen Charlotte, who of course were themselves at the show seeing this too. So, as everyone who saw it knew, this was a portrait of past regicide, an implicit threat of future regicide, and it created an absolute sensation. But here's what really fascinated me when I stumbled across reference to this painting in the archives of the Royal Academy of Art. So this is 5 years into the war, 5 years after the Battle of Lexington and Concord kicked off conflict between England and its North American colonies. And the fact that it made it into the show at all is astonishing. As I mentioned, it was a jury selection. And although some people in newspapers and private correspondence did say that it was treasonous, should be taken off the wall, and it was an insult to decency, other people went on public record saluting it as an entertaining defense of constitutional liberties, saying that Americans were actually holding up the flag of British liberty and constitutional rights better than Britons themselves. And the fact that it was on display at all in the Royal Academy, and the fact that people had divided opinions about it 5 years into the war in London, reminded me that the war we now call the American Revolution was, in fact, a civil war fought on both sides of the Atlantic. And it was fought by artists as well as soldiers, and in the courts of public opinion as well as on the battlefields. So if you go to the next slide, I'll get into the story of why this portrait no longer survives, and what it says about how we should think about the art and artifacts from the past in general. Because art, like many things, doesn't survive the havoc of history, and what's preserved in our museums and on display in them is only a tiny bit of what was once created and seen. Wright's portrait of his mother, for example, survives only in the archival documentation that I've referenced, because it likely was lost at sea. In 1781, Joseph Wright left London for Paris, and before he left, he created this self-portrait of himself, which I think reflects both his defiant American patriotism, but also the sort of scandalous persona that he developed after displaying that portrait at the Royal Academy. I'll read it in case it's unclear from your laptop or computer perspective. He has this sort of defiant pose, I think, hands in his pockets. And he's also labeled himself Yankee Doodle or the American Satan. So he's really leaning into that pro-American response to the war. And partly because of this, he does leave London for Paris. And in 1782, with the help of their good family friend, Benjamin Franklin, he sets sail for America. He had a plum commission to create a sculpture and a painting of George Washington. And he sails on the Boston-bound ship, the Argo, which you'll see in the next slide. After a 10-week journey, battling gusts of snow-filled wind, on its last day at sea, the ship approached the Maine coast and ran aground on a pile of rocks. And the passengers managed to make it safely ashore, but much of the ship's cargo, including Wright's paintings, was lost, washed out of the ship's hold, or sunk below the waves. And I open with this story because although his portrait may have sunk under the Atlantic, even though it's physically lost, it offers an invaluable window into the revolutionary past. And I like to use it as a sort of opening metaphor for the book, because much as we can dive to retrieve shipwrecked things from the bottom of the sea, we can dive in a historical sense to tell histories that allow us to see previously submerged stories about the past. And much like shipwrecked things, just because these stories about the past have been previously submerged, hidden, or forgotten, does not mean they're not there. And in The Painter's Fire, which in the next slide, you'll see the lovely cover again. In The Painter's Fire, what I hope to do is to dive in art historical and historical fashion to bring these revolutionary portraits, both literal and figurative, of people up from the depths of the past and into the light. And this allows us to see a new transatlantic history of the American Revolution and the creative people who helped to make it, one that transforms the way we think of patriotism and who were patriots then and now. And these artists are important to this story because the American Revolution was not just fought in the colonies. It wasn't just fought with muskets and bayonets. On both sides of the Atlantic, pro-American artists who were armed with paint, canvas, and wax helped to create revolutionary ideals. And at the center of The Painter's Fire are the lives of three of these remarkable artists devoted to liberty: Robert Edge Pine, Prince Demah, and Patience Wright, Joseph Wright's mother. And in part because of who they were, women, men of color enslaved and free, and Britons living in England for the duration of the war, these patriot artists were excluded from formal political or military power. They couldn't sit in Continental Congress or lead the Continental Army. Instead, they fired shots against the king on the walls of the Royal Academy and used wax museums to run international spy rings. And together, I think their experiences testify to the promise of liberty. These were people who were not motivated by economic gains, like, expanding west, across the Proclamation line or anything like that. These were people who were living in London and Paris, were all a part of the revolution, and they were motivated because they thought that Americans were embracing the cause of liberty in its truest and most fascinating possibilities. They also, though, I think, testify to the limits of the promise of liberty that was made in founding documents like the Declaration of Independence. The idea that all men are created equal, but that women and men of color and immigrants have not always achieved the same levels of the promise of liberty and equality that others in America have. So I think they offer us ideas for the future as well as thoughts about the past. And if you go to the next slide, I want to give a little snapshot look at each of them to sort of orient our later conversation. On the left, you see Robert Edge Pine's portrait of George Washington, which is at the National Portrait Gallery in America. Pine was an award-winning British artist, rumored to be of African descent, who made these massive history paintings and many portraits, and eventually emigrated to America after the war was done and opened America's first grand art museum in Philadelphia. And with apologies to Charles Wilson Peele, that is fact, and we can go into that more in the Q&A, hopefully. While he was still in London, Robert Edge Pine trained Prince Demah, then called Prince Demah Barnes, whose portrait of his enslaver Christian Barnes you see on the right. And Prince Demah was the first identifiable enslaved portrait painter in North America. And as I mentioned, he was Pine's pupil in London before he self-emancipated when his loyalist enslavers fled the United States, the not yet United States, for the safer climate of England. And he enlisted to fight for the Patriot cause in the Massachusetts militia. And in the middle is another portrait of Patience Wright, Joseph Wright's wax modeling mother, who opened my remarks. And you see her here posed as Liberty. She is holding a Liberty cap on a Liberty pole. And I think this really personifies how people in Britain at the time saw her as at the center of this always really active pro-American caucus that operated in Britain throughout the war, and that were made of British people like Robert Edge Pine as well as Patience Wright herself. And so together, I think they really offer us this window into this world in which they collide with famous people like Benjamin Franklin, George and Martha Washington, John and Abigail Adams, Phyllis Wheatley. But those famous people I put sort of on the sidelines in this book because I want to bring these, at the time, well known to famous people who agitated so fiercely for the American cause that have been largely forgotten. I wanted to bring them up from the depths. So if you go to the next slide, I'll show you a few of the very few remaining samples of their work. We can go into this in our conversation later about why so few survive, in part because large collections of the Wright's Wax Museum materials and Robert H. Pine's paintings went up in flames, and didn't just go up in flames, this is why I love history, went up in flames in the same fire because they ended up together. I can offer some more thoughts on that later. But this is one of 3 paintings by Prince Demah that survives, and this is at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And it's of a Scottish merchant called William Duguid, who was living in Boston. And I want to talk a little bit about this portrait because I think it gives some real understanding of the talent of Prince Demah, this at the time enslaved portrait painter who was painting portraits professionally in Boston. So this is a deeply symbolic portrait. It shows William Duguid wearing the goods that he traded, in this case, Indian chintz that's been made into a banyan or a dressing gown. The dressing gown itself is something that a man of leisure and learning would wear while he was engaged in reading and thinking and writing. And you see that referenced in the books in the bookcase behind him. And then the shirt on his that he's wearing is fashioned by the same brooch that you see to the right of the portrait, which is made of red garnets, symbolizing love and affection. And I think that the family really loved this portrait because not only did they save the portrait, but they saved the brooch alongside it, and it descended in the family for generations before it ended up in the collections of the Met Museum. And the other thing that's brilliant about this is that this brooch also announces that this man is Scottish. It's a witch's heart or Lucan Booth. And so I love this because it shows that Prince Demah is highly skilled in sophisticated symbolism, just like artists trained at the Royal Academy. It's also extraordinary because it's signed, and you can see the big Prince Demah in the little tiny Barnes, which is his enslaver's last name. And he does in fact get rid of the Barnes when they flee the country, and he enlists in the Massachusetts militia under the name of Prince Demah. And Demah is an African name that his mother Daphne, who was stolen from Africa as a girl, gave him. So his loyal enslavers, if you go to the next slide, they were the type of people who were so enamored of the crown that they gave up all of their possessions involuntarily after, among other things, a horse was tarred and feathered in their name. We can talk about that in the Q&A perhaps. The only time an animal was tarred and feathered during the American Revolution. And you can imagine that this violence and threat of violence was very alarming to them. So they're examples of people who were born in America, but their political convictions sent them to England during the American Revolution. Robert H. Pine was the antithesis. He was born in Britain. He was well off in Britain. He was, had gentleman status. He was a famous and award-winning painter. But he had such political attachment to America that he ended up moving to the United States after the War of Independence ended. Now, Robert H. Pine, I show you a few samples of his work because I think you see his politics in his paintings even before the American Revolution occurred. Here are portraits that he made of Catherine Macaulay, who's a famous British woman historian who wrote a multi-volume history of England, beloved by American founders like Washington and Adams. During the war itself, an American visiting London had dinner with her, and she said, King Charles I was bad, but George III is worse. So Americans, you can understand why, loved her. And when they thought about what she looked like, they thought of this image by Robert H. Pine, which was copied in a print and even into an American, into a ceramic, that little figure you see below her portrait, which was produced in 1775 in England and is labeled American Congress. And so you can see that here British manufacturers are making a direct connection between Catherine Macaulay's thoughts about Republican government and the American efforts in 1775, and they're using Robert Edge Pine's image to do so. He similarly made a wildly popular image of John Wilkes, who is the darling of adherents of liberty on both sides of the Atlantic because he's imprisoned by the king without the due process of habeas corpus for suggesting and writing that King George III is not the son of King George II. That's a bad no-no in monarchical times, and he becomes a cause célèbre for due process being respected. And Robert Edge Pine's image of him was the one that circulated. And it even ended up on things like the snuff box that you see below his portrait, which I love thinking about. You know, people, I guess, must have wanted to sniff their tobacco and think about Wilkes and liberty, which is great. It tells you a lot about the 18th century and how it's a little strange and different from ourselves. In the next slide, you will see one of the reasons why we think that Robert Edge Pine was of African descent. This is his father, John Pine, who's an engraver, friends with William Hogarth. So this is this, you know, very successful, multi-generational family of successful artists who are connected to king and court, which makes it all the more astonishing that Robert Edge Pine, out of political conviction, leaves all of that behind to emigrate to America in 1783. So if we go to the next slide, we'll see that one of the reasons he emigrates, I think, is because he claims that it's hard for him to get business in London and in Bath after he makes things like this print, America, which you see on the left, which shows America bringing the blessings of peace and plenty to a world that Britain had tried to keep it from. And in this, he was financed by one of George Washington's best friends from Virginia, George William Fairfax, also rumored to be of African descent. And here on the right, you see that George William Fairfax, even though he's living in England and has connections to English nobility, is also motivated by this pro-American political stance. There's this whole community of them in Bath who are working to sort of keep the American cause and adherence to it alive within Britain itself. And you'll see that one of the things George William Fairfax did was help to finance the production of this massive history painting to create a small version of it in print form. And one of the things that George William Fairfax did was when he bought copies, he sent one to his good friend George Washington, where it still hangs today in the dining room at Mount Vernon. So you can see all these great transatlantic connections that are being made through the art. So if you go to the next slide, one of the last pieces that Robert Edge Pine made before he leaves England for America to establish this art museum and paint the great narrative moments of the American Revolutionary War, he paints a portrait of his friend Patience Wright, the wax sculptor who began this talk. And I love this portrait, which is also at the National Gallery, Portrait Gallery in Washington, D.C. I love it because I think that you can see there's, you know, the hint of something under her diaphanous cloth on her lap. So I think it's a nod to her cheeky, sensational way of making her wax figures. And they were connected on personal as well as political and artistic levels. And so really interesting to think about, again, this group of ardently pro-American artists operating in England throughout the war who retain these tight connections and never stop making pro-American art, even though there's a treason act on the books, which could easily have sent them to prison. Thousands of Americans are imprisoned in England during the war. But I think that their shared devotion to the cause is evident through the art they continue to make. Patience Wright, this is the only one of her full-length wax models, such as the exact type that would not have been allowed to be on display at the Royal Academy. And one of the reasons for that, I think, is that overwhelmingly the people who made full-length wax figures were women. And the Royal Academy, when it was founded, was very male-centric, very male-dominated. So there's a lot of power hierarchies going on here. Sir Joshua Reynolds, who was the first president of the Royal Academy, also disliked wax figures because he thought they were too realistic, and he thought great art needed a touch of romantic imagination to be truly good. And if you go and see this statue, which you can in Westminster Abbey, you will see it is marvelously lifelike. There are little tiny hairs embedded in the wax on the hands. And this was created by Patience Wright and her daughter Phoebe in the wake of the death of this man, William Pitt, the Earl of Chatham, who famously collapsed on the House of Lords floor and died after giving an impassioned speech urging clemency to the American colonists. And she was commissioned to make this piece, and he is wearing the robes in which he collapsed and died. So it's an example of this fascinating art that I think we see now in Madame Tussauds and think of it in that context. But at the time, I think one of the reasons it was so wildly popular was, think of what it's like before photography, before film. To see people in paintings on the left is a very different experience than to see these wax figures in this three-dimensional, hyper-realistic way. And one of my favorite stories about Patience Wright's work is that Abigail Adams, who I think none of us think as easily flustered, Abigail Adams, who called her the Queen of Sluts at one point. I can go into that in the Q&A if you'd like. But Abigail Adams, when she visited Patience Wright's London Wax Museum, confessed that she found herself speaking for a few moments to the figure in wax of a clergyman who she thought was a real person. And I absolutely love this anecdote because I think none of us think of Abigail Adams as easily fooled, but here she was, fooled by the realism of Patience Wright's art. So I mentioned that Patience Wright operated as a spy for the Americans during the war. She absolutely did. She sent letters to her good friend Benjamin Franklin across the Channel in France. I don't know that she was great at her espionage technique because I found letters in the British Library from the sort of 18th century version of British MI6 saying, we found another one of Mrs. Wright's letters to Franklin, but we're going to let it go through because her information is really bad, so it might actually do our cause more good than harm. So I'm not sure how effective she was, but she was out there trying, and she was risking her life and her fortune, certainly, in doing so. She also gathered information from sitting in Parliament, from talking to the famous people who came in and out of her museum with regularity. And she wrote the information down and sent them secreted in wax heads that she shipped across the Atlantic to her sister Rachel, who operated a wax museum in Philadelphia that was frequented by members of Continental Congress. So all this is to say that here's this woman who was operating an international spy ring. Her daughters and her sister are helping her in it. Patience Wright liked to remind her male friends like Benjamin Franklin and John Dickinson that, as she put it, women are always useful in grand events. And I think that the Wright family is a really great reminder of the fact that Abigail Adams is not a one-off in terms of saying, remember the ladies. There were lots of women during the American Revolution who were ardent patriots and wanting to do their utmost to further the American cause. Sadly, she died before she could return to America. What she really wanted to do was return to America and make a wax figure museum, which would have had full-size wax figures of all the founders, so they would have looked like this William Pitt figure, but you would have seen Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, George Washington in 3D hyper-realistic wax, and it would have been installed at what is now called Independence Hall. And I so regret that this did not happen because she died before it could occur. But her friend, Robert H. Pine, did make it to America, and if you go to the next slide, you'll see some of his activities there. He painted, as I mentioned, this portrait of George Washington, which I love because I think this reflects Washington as he really was at the end of the war. As he himself put it, that he'd grown old in the service of his country. We think of George Washington now as this like mythic, iron-jawed, marble figure. But I think at the end of the war, Washington was tired and a little haggard from his efforts. And I think that this Robert H. Pine portrait really captures that. He also painted, at Martha Washington's request, portraits of her grandchildren and niece, and you see some samples of those on the left. Again, they hung at Mount Vernon. They continue to, copies of them continue to hang there today. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see that one of the things that he did was paint many, many portraits of famous and wealthy people in America in the short time that he was in the States, from about 1783 to the late 1780s. But one of the reasons he was able to do so was because his daughters, who were artists, helped him in his work. And on the left, you see one of his daughters, Charlotte. He had 5 daughters, at least 3 of them were artists. And when they came to America, the daughters and his wife came too. His wife was also an artist, but none of her art survives. They had this really interesting technique that no one has ever done before or since. He would go and paint the head of the person. You can see this in this example of Robert Morris on the right. He would paint the head of the person from life, cut it out, glue it onto a larger canvas, and then his daughters would come in and do the rest of the portrait, so the background and the body, etc. And because of this, they had this sort of assembly line of painting production. And I think you can really see in this example the head sort of, popping up a little bit, which is marvelous. So all of these portraits really should be called Robert H. Pine and Daughters. Because the women were very instrumental in creating these. Robert Morris was so taken by Robert H. Pine that he built him a mansion in Philadelphia. The entire second floor gallery was filled with massive history paintings, Shakespeare scenes, scandalously the first Venus de Milo copy seen in America. And this was the first great art museum in the United States, operating in Philadelphia in the 1780s. But it's been sort of lost to our collective memory. And if you go to the next slide, that brings me to an important point I want to make about the fact that when we think about artists of the Revolution now, we think about Trumbull and Copley and Peale, and rightly so. But at the time, Robert H. Pine was far more important of an artist than any of these men were. And he was seen by Americans like the Washingtons as the most important artist who'd ever come to North America. So I think that we can see, even though to our eyes, the portraits like the one of Martha Washington's Custis grandchildren you see on the left don't look like what we think of as the Revolutionary era portraits, which we think of more in the style of a Peale or a Trumbull. But if you compare it to the portrait on the right, which is the one that Martha Washington had of her children by John Wollaston, and these children, I have to say, I think look rather feral. So, if you think about what Americans had before Robert H. Pine arrived, you see the difference in quality. And if you go to the next slide, I think one of the reasons that it's regrettable that he died before he could achieve his dream and that his paintings went up largely in smoke in that same fire I mentioned with Patience Wright's wax figures is that he would have given us a much more realistic, less mythologized visual version of the American Revolution. Here you see his only history painting that survives in a copied form by Edward Savage, and this is called Congress Voting Independence. And it is a faithful reproduction of the interior of what we now call Independence Hall. And if you look at the figures, Benjamin Franklin, who's in the front middle, has really bad posture. There are some protruding bellies. There are some not very handsome figures in here. And if you go to, and they're sitting in the Windsor chairs, we know they sat in blinds on the windows. But if you go to the next slide, you'll see John Trumbull's famous copy of Robert H. Pine's original, and he's photoshopped the heck out of this thing. So every man has a well-turned calf, velvet upholstered chairs, velvet swag on the windows. The ceiling has been raised by many feet, and everyone has excellent, excellent posture. Now, this is not to cast shade on Trumbull. I think Trumbull is a wonderful artist who did a wonderful job creating a narrative, a shared narrative of the American Revolution. But I like to think, what would our collective visual memory, what would our collective memory be like if instead of American-born white men like Trumbull and Peale and Copley, we thought about this group of forgotten artists, people who were women, men of color, and people who lived in Britain yet were devoted to the American cause. What if we thought about their vision instead? We would have a wax figure of founders in Independence Hall. We would have, we'd have recognition of this more realistic art. And I think that we would, had their art survived, we'd have a different visual memory of the Revolution. And I also think thinking about their lives and their contributions have to make us revise our collective understanding of who a patriot in the American founding era is. It's not just a white man leading a battle charge on a horse or writing a pamphlet in the continental United States. That's an important part of the story, but it's only part of it, because Revolutionary era patriotism was far more cosmopolitan, geographically broad, and diverse than I think we often remember it to be. And the patriots who dedicated themselves to the cause of the American independence and liberty included Black and mixed race people, women, people from outside what became the national boundaries of the United States, and people who practiced idiosyncratic politics through espionage and paint and wax. And I think that as we approach the nation's 250th next year, it is imperative that we broaden our understanding of who American patriots were, where they fought, what they looked like, and what weapons they used to fight. And I think that doing so helps us to better understand the bizarre richness of the past in all its complexity. And I think it also allows us to come together to have conversations about what that means for our present and our future as a nation moving forward. So thank you so much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Zara, thank you so much for that fantastic presentation on your book, which is marvelous. Angela, do you have announcements to do now, or do you want to do them later? You're muted. I still can't hear you. Okay, so we will continue with the discussion. So I have some questions, just a couple questions for you, Zara,
Yes.
and then we will turn it over to Q&A from the audience, and Angela will have some announcements before that happens. So, so a shadow that hangs over everything that happens in the book is loss of the artistic output of the people that you're talking about. And you're a historian of material things. That's what you're so great at working at is the world of physical things and what they can tell us about the past. But we only have three of Prince Demah's paintings, only the one statue by Patience Wright, not many of Robert Pine's paintings left at all. Um, so how did you, as a historian who is accustomed to working with physical stuff, approach a project where most of the physical stuff that um, sets the frame of this book is gone?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's one that I had to wrestle with because, as you say, I'm used to, like, my first book. I had 800 watercolor drawings to look at by this silk designer. So more art than I could talk about, right? And thousands of pieces of silk that I could talk about. And so I think that this book was the opposite problem. I had to think about how do you recreate a world that is largely only present in your imagination. Thankfully, I think print culture helps a lot because a lot of these lost things were represented in print form. So if the painting is gone, at least the print remains, but not in every case. And the wax figures weren't made into print form. So, there's a big loss there. So on the one hand, it is a challenge, as you say, because you don't have the thing to look at. On the other hand, I think that all history is an act of reimagining in some ways, right? And so I don't think that the process was that different. I just had to sort of think of the art and the images as and the figures as something that I had to try to recreate in my own mind, which I think made it easier to recreate for the reader in some senses. And so I think, I have this image in my head, for example, of what Joseph Wright's portrait of his mother would have looked like. But I don't know, for example, where the busts of King George and Charlotte were in the portrait or anything like that. But in some ways, I think it's nice for readers because it means that everyone can sort of create their own image, which is, kind of choose your own adventure material culture analysis, which is kind of fun.
Right.
But I think one of the things it made me think of, in a methodological way is that it is really important for us to think about the stuff that doesn't survive because, we have wonderful collections like the, millions of things you have at the Clements Library. But that's only a tiny bit of what was,
Right.
created from the time periods you've collected. And I think it's important for people to remember that there is a lot that is lost from the past. And so, we should not ever go to a museum or historical collection and assume that that's it. And sometimes that's accidental. Sometimes that's, a fire or a shipwreck. But sometimes that reflects, historical collecting or art historical collecting practices that reflect the fact that, at certain periods of time, certain people are seen as more worthy of collecting than others, right? In the Massachusetts Historical Society, the first American historical society was founded in 1791. They were certainly not rushing out to collect, papers by, you know, emancipated free people, right? They were collecting the
Yeah.
Addams Family papers, and there's a reason for that. And
Right.
so I think that thinking it's important for us to think about the missing things as well as the present things and why they're missing, as well as, trying to repaint a picture of them.
Right. The thing I love most about that Abigail Adams story is that it is the most characteristically Adams thing ever to talk to someone for 5 minutes and not notice that they're not a real person, because it seems like that's what everybody in that house was doing. Um,
I love that. Yes, I'm going to steal that.
so there are a couple moments in the book that there's these sort of coincidences of history that I absolutely love. So one is that when Phyllis Wheatley is in London, um, uh, Brooke Morgan, is that his name? No, Watson, Brooke Watson,
Brooke
uh,
Watson. Hmm.
of the famous painting by John Singleton Copley, Watson and the Shark, which many of you have seen. He survived being attacked by the shark in the Havana Harbor and was living in London and gave Phyllis Wheatley a copy of John Milton's Paradise Lost, which is, for people who have read Wheatley, Milton's echoes are everywhere in her poems. So the fact that this person who is in this famous painting by Copley meets Phyllis Wheatley, gives her a copy of Milton, or the fact that all of the copies of Wheatley's book of poetry that are coming over from England are late to market in Boston because they're on the ship that's carrying the tea that is thrown into the harbor during the Boston Tea Party. Um, they're wonderful coincidences on one hand, but they also speak to like the smallness of the worlds that these people occupied, right? So there's a lot of conversation in early American history about vast early America and how capacious and huge the field is. But the worlds that these people lived in were really very small. I mean, you make some great points in the book about how when Prince Demah and um, uh, Phyllis Wheatley are living in Boston, they're 3 blocks away from each other. And same thing in London. Like all these people, all these artists, when they're in London, are a 15-minute walk away.
Hmm.
Um, can you talk a little bit about sort of the overlapping nature of these worlds and what it means to your the work you're doing in the book that a lot of these people probably knew each other. I mean, you write a lot of them obviously did know each other, and that's a big part of what you talk about. But other people um, probably met one another but we don't know what those
Yeah.
conversations were like.
Yeah, absolutely. So, one of the reasons that I do transatlantic history is I think that it is a way of understanding that their world is small. The Atlantic Ocean was a bridge, not a barrier, right? We think of it today as this vast, sort of geographic divide. And in the 18th century, certainly, they knew it was vast, but they crossed it with regularity and their connections were, enmeshed in letter form as well as physical contact. And all of these people are hopping around the Atlantic world and bumping into each other. In, one of the other stories of coincidence that I love, that I talk about in the book, is Ebenezer Smith Platt, who is an American patriot who attacks a private gets goods off of a British privateer ship that's been attacked by American patriots in Georgia and ends up in Jamaica bumping into the captain of the ship that he'd helped rob. And they're out drinking together because apparently that's fine. But, at a certain point, he is asked to drink a toast against Americans and he refuses to. And so the ship captain turns him in and he ends up getting arrested and ends up crossing the Atlantic, going from ship to ship, shackled in chains, ends up in London where they've just passed a treason act. And so he gets, popped into prison with no due process, with shackles on for 18 months, and ends up getting freed through the efforts of Patience Wright and her daughter Elizabeth, who he marries, and they go to France and hang out with Benjamin Franklin. So there are all these, so that's one example where you're hopping from Georgia to Jamaica, crossing the Atlantic, and ending up in London, and all these people are connected. And
Mhm.
what a random set of coincidences that is. And I think one of the things that I emphasize in the book too is that these are not, again, it's to expand the notion of who was integral to these worlds. And just like our social networks or professional networks today, it's not just white men operating in these worlds, right? They are connected with Black people enslaved and free, and with women, and it's these worlds where personal connections deeply matter, and they're playing into the political. Um, and I think the example of Watson and Wheatley is a great one too, and I love that. And just when I talk about Phyllis Wheatley in London, and she and Prince Demah almost overlap in London, but they certainly are coexisting in Boston, as you say, like 3 blocks away from each other. And I do think, and I go into why in the book, that he was the one who painted her portrait in the frontispiece, not Scipio Moorhead, for a variety of reasons. But when you think about the fact that when they're in London, they're meeting the same people and they're in the same groups, and those same groups of people are being painted by Robert Edge Pine, and their portraits in wax are being made by Phyllis Wheatley. And yes, the world is big, but it's also really small.
Right.
And I love that. So I think it just, it increases the richness of it. And I think, for example, you get a different George and Martha Washington from this perspective. You
Mhm.
get a George Washington who is flexible and able to change his mind about issues like whether Black men should serve in the military, and why he might have made the decision. And you get a Martha Washington who we should understand as the real art connoisseur and patron of the family, not George. She's the one driving those decisions. And I don't think that's a way most people think of Martha Washington. So even these famous people who've been talked about time and time again, if you put them into these broader networks in this very small world, you get a really different picture of them.
Yeah. So I have just one more question, and it's about art and politics. So a lot of the book is about the political beliefs, the political activity of the artists that you're writing about. But they also produced art that was itself political, in a lot of cases, really brave. I mean, Joseph Wright
Mhm.
showing a painting of the severed head of Charles I in the Royal Academy is a remarkably brave thing to do.
It's wild,
Um,
isn't
yeah,
it?
you mentioned and you talk about in the book Phyllis Wheatley's Ode to the Earl of Dartmouth, which is my favorite of her poems, and in large part because it is such a brave poem, because it's this young enslaved black girl in Boston writing to the Earl of Dartmouth saying, "Oh, I've heard you value freedom. Let me tell you why I value freedom. It's because I was kidnapped as a child and never saw my parents again."
Mhm.
That's a really brave thing to write to a British lord. So can you talk a little bit about what in this age of revolution made a work of art political? A lot of the portraits um, that you looked at, you're so good at sort of teasing out small signs. The brooch shows that the merchant was Scottish. What what would people at the time have seen in a work of art that made them think of it as a political painting?
Mhm. It's a great question, and I think we can think that art is always a powerful part of political movements. I think any political movement, regardless of its ideological bent. And so these artists used both really smack you over the head iconography and also really subtle things to make political statements. So, starting with subtle, if you think of the portrait of John Wilkes that I showed you by Robert Edge Pine, John Wilkes was a famously ugly man. Famously ugly. I mean, people talked about just how horrific he was to look at. Pine paints a really flattering portrait of him. And I think that shows there's a politics to that. He is showing, he's gilding that lily to, make a point about how we should admire John Wilkes. And so I don't think it's accidental that his is the image that ends up on some of the also objects that people buy who share their same ideology, not the William Hogarth image of John Wilkes where he looks like, a leering, salacious, hot mess. So I think that that's a very subtle political thing. And on the flip side of that, if you look at, I didn't show this image, but Robert Edge Pine has a portrait of King George II, who was not very attractive. He had very bulbous eyes, and, this is the father of George III. Robert Edge Pine's portrait of him is much less flattering than most other portraits of him.
Mm.
And so I think you already seeing his sort of, his anti-monarchical, pro-Republican with a little R sentimentalities in his
Right.
art just by how flattering he is or isn't. Now, on the other hand, he produces this art that is flagrantly making statements, like his America painting and print. And that did get him in some trouble, and he lost some patronage because of it. because that is an image in which you are showing that America is bringing peace and plenty and prosperity, not just to a new United States, but to the entire world. And
Mhm.
that is something that Patience Wright and Robert Edge Pine and some others who were pro the American cause living in Britain, that's one of the reasons they backed the American cause. They thought that Britain had crumbled into corruption and decay and had, stepped away from its long history of constitutional liberties. But America had picked up that standard and was moving it forward for the world. And so they used these allegories about America bringing the blessings of a new empire of liberty, not just to Americans, but to Britons, to everybody. And
Mhm.
so you see these really overt political messages in things like that. And things like the ceramic figurine. This happens in material culture as well as art. The ceramic figurine of Catherine Macaulay that I showed you, where, in case you didn't have the wherewithal yourself to make the connections between the American political protests and her writings about English history, they write American Congress on the bottom of her statue. So
Right.
even the, most obtuse person can be like, oh yeah, her books are, something that American revolutionaries can take inspiration from.
Right. Um, I want to see if Angela is. Can, I cannot hear you. Can you hear her, Zara? Is it
No,
just
I
me? No,
can't.
okay.
No, I can't.
I can't hear her, Paul, but I'm happy to finish up the program.
Okay.
Can you hear me now?
Oh,
Yes,
yes.
now I can hear you.
Okay, it's because my Zoom phone rang while the program was going on, but I had to try a couple things to fix it. Silly Zoom phone. All righty. So
Well,
let
welcome
me
back.
thank you. Thank you. That was really wonderful. And I'll just remind everybody, if you have questions, put them in the Q&A section and we'll get to those momentarily. But before we do that, I'll do a bit of housekeeping. Applications for the 2026-27 research fellowships are now being accepted until January 15th. The Clements Library offers funded research fellowships for a wide array of projects undertaken by graduate students, postdoctoral scholars, independent researchers, creative artists, and undergraduates. So please pass that information on to everyone you know who might be interested in studying at the Clements Library and get your applications in. Our current exhibit for all ages will be closing in person on December 23rd. So you can visit Friday, Monday, Tuesday from noon to 4 if you're in the area, or you can check it out online. So that means that we have a new exhibit coming up that will open on January 16th. And we will also kick off the 2026 season of the Bookworm with Revolutionary Pain, a student curated exhibit. And that will be in celebration of the 250th anniversary of the publication of Thomas Paine's Common Sense. Students in revolutionary political thought in early America and beyond from the fall 2025 semester co-curated the exhibition. So we invite you then next month to join Clements Librarian for Instruction and Engagement, Maggie Vanderford, and Professor Andy Murphy with a panel of students as they discuss the behind-the-scenes work for the exhibit. Also, please note that the Clements Library will be closed for the holidays from December 25th through January 1st, reopening on January 2nd. We certainly love our whole community, and we call our community of donors the Clements Library Associates. If you are interested in sponsoring an episode of the Bookworm, you can reach out to me or Ann Bennington Helper, or perhaps you'd like to make a donation to keep all of the wonderful things going that the Clements Library does. And we, of course, welcome that as well. Right, and on to questions.
You, thank you so much, Angela. So, you have some great questions in the Q&A. So the first question is about the Queen of Sluts reference that you mentioned.
Yes.
Marianne says we need to know more. She says she finds it hard to think of Abigail Adams being so coarse. So tell us about that
Mhm.
story.
Yeah, so as I was saying, Paul, in our conversation, some of these famous people come off differently in this book, and I think Abigail Adams, chief among them. So I'm not surprised. This is surprising to our audience. So when Abigail Adams was crossing the Atlantic to join her husband John, who was the first United States diplomat at the court of St. James in London, she wrote a lot of really lengthy letters to her sister. And one of the things she wrote was that she was excited to see the three greatest living American artists working in London, and that they were Benjamin West, John Singleton Copley, and Patience Wright. Because, Patience Wright was famous on both sides of the Atlantic for her. She was widely thought to be an artistic genius. And so when she got to London, she was excited to visit Patience Wright's wax museum. When she came in, Patience Wright grabbed her and kissed her on both cheeks and was very familiar with her. And Abigail Adams did not like, she's too New England to like this, right? Like it's a very, and she just found her way too familiar. And she said that she thought of her as the queen of sluts. And at the time, I should say slut, it was leaning into a sexual connotation, but it meant more someone who was slovenly and kind of sloppy. And so it did have that bit of sexual titillation behind it, but that wasn't the primary meaning. So yeah, it was coarse for Abigail Adams, but I think she did not like the familiarity with which Patience Wright treated herself and her husband and their children. And so one of the funny things is she goes back to that letter and she crosses Patience right off the list of the three greatest artists, which is very funny. But yes, a different Abigail Adams, even though she had
Right.
to admit that she was fooled by that clergyman.
Right. Well, those of us at the Clements are happy to hear that Benjamin West is on the list since we get to see the death of General Wolfe every day hanging in the reading room. So,
Oh, love that. Yes, and he, as you know, plays a pretty big role in this book. So
yep,
he
yep,
pops up quite a few times.
yeah. So Lisa has a question. Do you think that these people are forgotten just because their works have been destroyed, or are there other reasons that um, people today don't know about these artists?
Yeah, I think it's a combination. So I think had more of Patience Wright's art survived, for example, we would probably know more about her because, I think that there would have been something really compelling about seeing all these 18th century figures in 3D wax. The thing about wax figures, as you might guess, is they're really flammable. So
Mhm.
not only are they made of beeswax, but they in the 18th century were mixed with turpentine to make them pliable for the artists. And then the armature of the bodies is not wax, usually the part that's hidden by clothes, but it's cardboard and wood and fabric. And so, it's basically a huge candle waiting to go off. And paintings are the same. If they're exposed to fire, they don't survive well. So a lot of this is the sort of accidental havoc of history and disaster, right? On the other hand, I think that some of it, and I think Prince Demah is the best example of this, some of it is that in his case, he would not have been as valued as an artist because of his formerly enslaved status, and then the fact that he was a self-emancipated black man.
Mhm.
So he's working in this very formal tradition. He's the only enslaved person we know of who was sent to London, to study professionally. And the reason he was sent to London instead of training in Boston was that Copley refused to train him on account of his race in Boston. But in London, he found this award-winning painter who trained him, as he told his enslaver, on account of his genius. I think it was also because they had this shared African heritage. So, the realities of Prince Demah and why his art wasn't collected is I don't think it would have been as valued at the time and moving forward. I think there's a lot more Prince Demah art out there. We know that he made a lot more paintings because of documentation in archives and account books and such. But only three of his paintings survive. But I think, for example, that there's one in New England that I've uncovered that I need to go look
Hmm.
at in person. But so I think it's a combination of natural disaster and certain types of people's work not being as valued as others. And
Mhm.
this is something that we're just now starting to address, I think, in the 21st century, because on Instagram, I feel like every day I see we found another Italian Renaissance masterwork that wasn't by a man, but is actually by a woman, and it's not always Artemisia, right? It's someone else. So I think that a lot of these, just like Robert Edgepine's daughters, we know they made the art. Their names have been left off the label because they were women.
Right. Um, Miriam wonders if you found evidence of iconoclasm, so paintings or other works of art being destroyed or damaged for
Yes.
political reasons and not just because of fire and shipwrecks.
Absolutely. So the image I showed you of Christian Barnes by Prince Demah, Christian Barnes is the wife part of the husband-wife enslaver team who also were his art patrons. And if some of you might have noticed there was a weird gash in her chest, and that is because after the Barneses had this horse tarred and feathered to send a message to them to stop being loyalists and start becoming patriots, which they never did, and after Christian Barnes was held up at gunpoint in her own house, they were scared off by the Patriots and they left for Nova Scotia and then England. Now, if you were a loyalist and you left your property behind, it could be confiscated by the Patriot government. And that, in fact, is what happened to the Barneses. Many properties, all their possessions, and it was given over to the use of General Henry Knox and his wife Lucy, which was very upsetting to Christian because she'd known Lucy since they were girls, and she was like, Lucy knows better than to use my piano and my furniture and my portraits. Um, but it's the reality that if you were loyalist, you could lose all your possessions if you stayed loyal to the crown. When the Patriots came to commandeer the house in its possession for Henry Knox, they drove a bayonet through the heart of the portrait of the Barneses. And so it was an act of iconoclasm against these loyalists, sort of like we finally drove them out of town. So it's fascinating because if you go see those portraits in person, which you can at the Hingham Historical Society, it's really evident that that it is a bayonet. You can tell the sort of jagged edges, and so that's one very dramatic example of iconoclasm against art being a very deliberate thing. The other one I talk about in the book that's famous is the tearing down of the statue of King George III in Manhattan. But there's an interesting story that doesn't get told as much that I brought out because this is a transatlantic history of British officers actually saving the decapitated head and burying it in the ground so the Patriots wouldn't get it and melt it down into bullets like they did most of the rest of the statue. And then unearthing it when they were leaving New York and shipping across the Atlantic, where Lady Gage, who's the wife of one of the British military commanders, had it on a sofa and would, covered up and would show it to loyalists that she was keeping it for safekeeping. Where that head
Yes.
is now, we don't know. But, so iconoclasm tells some fascinating stories on both sides.
Wow. Um, well, as you know, we have the Thomas Gage papers here at the Clements, and so it may still be somewhere in the Gage family house.
Oh, I need to come.
Yeah. So Rebecca has a question. Did any of your three artists express an interest in Native Americans, either as pictorial symbols or as Americans themselves?
hmm I don't know about Prince Demah, although it would not have been uncommon. Before he was a painter, he was a mariner. And so New England mariners, there were a lot of Black mariners, there were a lot of mixed race, so black and white, but also black and indigenous mariners who worked on those ships together. So would be very unlikely that he didn't have some personal connection to indigenous people from New England. We don't know about there's no evidence of it in his art, however. Patience Wright, one of the things she does that's really interesting is when news of the Battle of Lexington and Concord reaches London, she's outraged. She allegedly, there's no archival documentation to this, but it's a persistent story. She allegedly marches up to the king. I mean, she's familiar with him. She's done his portrait in wax multiple times. And she cheekily called him George instead of Your Majesty, but she marched up to him and berated him for shedding the blood of his subjects in Massachusetts. Don't know if that story's true or not, but what she did certainly do was, after she heard the news, she made two new figures that she installed in her wax museum of an American indigenous man and his wife. And that was a symbol that this was an American space. So in doing that, she's doing what people throughout the Revolution, Paul Revere, Copley, many others did, which was to adapt old traditions of using the figure of an American indigenous person on maps and things to represent America. And that's certainly something that Robert Edgepine did, for example, in America. those of you who were looking closely might have seen that she's wearing a feathered headdress, which is one of the iconographic nods to, indigeneity, even though it's not actually what indigenous people were wearing in places like New England. But so yeah, they are definitely all leaning heavily into that immediate association of America with indigenous people.
Right. So Lauren has a question. She asks, since a lot of art was commandeered, how common is it that works of art from this period may remain in private collections? She's thinking about art that may still exist, but scholars don't know where they are. And this is the dream of everybody in the field of going into some old house in New England and, seeing the missing piece of art on the wall.
Yeah, I think it's very possible. So I think that I definitely think that's the case with Prince Demah's work.
Mm.
So one of the reasons that we know that that William Duguid piece is his is that he signed it. It's very rare for 18th century artists to sign their work. It's just not something that most people do. So when you do find a signed copy, it's, important and extraordinary. So he didn't sign his portraits of Christian and Henry Barnes, for example,
Okay.
but we know that they're his because of documentary evidence that, lines up. So yes, I think that there are other portraits that he did both in America and in England that, maybe we can uncover some of them. And I do think that I found one that it looks a lot to me like a Prince Demah, and it's a Boston-based family, so it would make complete sense. But yeah, so I think there are things still in people's attics, and Robert Edge Pine, for example, a lot of his work survives in English stately homes. So
Mm.
the work he did before he left America. So, and those are private collections, but you can go
Sure.
to the stately home and you can see it. And in a sense, it's no longer private, but Mount Vernon is a perfect example of this too. You have five paintings by Robert Edge Pine there. You have a plaster mold that Joseph Wright did of George Washington, and you have a copy of his Robert Edge Pine's print, America. So, that was they were there when it was a private home, and they
Right.
remain there as it's a publicly accessible collection. So
Yeah.
I think that we can think of it like that too. That we need to also remember that museums are not the only places we can find these things, but I do think that there are some things in attics and on people's walls, and they just don't know what they are.
Yeah. So I have one last question. What are you working on next?
Oh, the last question. So I've decided that I am very boring and I'm a one-trick pony. So my one trick seems to be that I find a painting that inspires me and then I write a book about it, inspired by it.
Uh,
So in the case of my first book, it was, Anne Shippen Willing's portrait by Robert Feek, who incidentally is Patience Wright's cousin. So that's fun. Hanging at the Winterthur Museum. In this case, it was that wonderfully symbolic portrait of William Duguid by Prince Demah that's hanging in the Met in the American wing, and is such a contrast to the big Washington crossing the Delaware, which is one of the reasons it struck me. So this time it was two portraits that were hanging sort of near each other at the Whaling Museum in Nantucket,
mm,
and one is of a black man and one is of a white woman, and it's so their portraits and thinking about their families' interconnected histories have inspired me to write their story. This is going to lean heavy on my architectural history past, which I haven't done in a while. But it's a story about how their families together elude recapturing of the black man's family by Virginia slave catchers who come to the island in the early 1820s, and a lot of the islanders get together and say, "Not on our island," and they manage to push this notorious slave catcher off the island, and the black family, continues to live free on the island, and a little girl of the white family at the time grows up to be the person who invites Frederick Douglass to come speak on the island for the first time, and is very very active in abolitionist circles. So it's about the sort of power of community to come together and resist, tearing people's lives apart
mm,
by overreach, as they thought of it, by the federal government. So,
yeah,
so what I do a lot with, portraits and architecture, but
right.
really another story about freedom.
Yeah. It sounds fantastic. As always, I cannot wait to read uh, anything that you write. Angela, do you have closing comments for us?
Was really wonderful. Thank you so much. And thanks everybody for joining us on a Friday morning. And happy holiday.
Yeah. Happy holidays, everyone. Great to see you, Zara.
Thank you. So great to see you too. And thanks everyone for joining us.